Good afternoon, or whatever time of day or night it is, at your place. And welcome to this webinar by CUTS on leveraging innovative finance for climate and biodiversity, onboarding the international community. So the way I propose to go about this is that I will make a few brief remarks at the outset and then invite each of the panelists to make their statements or presentations in about 10 to 12 minutes each. And after that, we can throw the floor open to the other participants with their comments and questions. And then maybe we can have a second round of comments and observations from the panelists. So if that is agreed, I will go ahead with my opening statement. Now, how much money is required by developing countries for addressing their Paris Agreement commitments on climate change and their commitments on biodiversity conservation? Now, these estimates are subject to wide ranges of uncertainty. However, considerable work has been done by scholars, and most scholars accept that the required funding is of the order of several trillions of US dollars per year. Whether it is 3 trillions or 5 trillions or 10 trillions, that is still a subject of considerable debate. Now, why do we need so much money for climate change? And the principal needs of climate change are for greenhouse gas mitigation, for adaptation, and to meet loss and damage from extreme climate events. And for many years, the belle of the ball was mitigation. But the principal requirements of the developing countries are for adaptation and loss and damage. And loss and damage has been onboarded only very recently. But we do know that the scale of funding required for adaptation as well as to meet loss and damage from extreme climate events are roughly of the same order. What are the major needs of financing for biodiversity conservation? The traditional approach has been guns and guards. So you protect biodiversity-rich areas from encroachment or illegal harvesting. But what is increasingly understood and recognized is that there is need for major funding, either for compensation for maintaining these biodiversity resources intact, or for enabling local populations who have been the custodians and guardians of biodiversity for millennia from obtaining livelihoods that are better from conservation of biodiversity than from being complicit in its degradation. Now, traditional development finance, including finance flows from all the multilateral financial institutions put together, that is the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, and the European Development Bank, as well as the BRICS Bank and what is now called the China Bank. The total scale of funding is roughly of the order of $100 billion a year, of which a very small proportion is actually concessional finance. And in relation to the needs, this is obviously grossly inadequate. In respect of climate change finance, $100 billion a year of new and additional funding, new and additional concessional funding was promised by industrialized countries as far back as 2009 in Copenhagen. And we have not yet met the 2009 goal. So any further pledges of financing by industrialized countries from their fisc or from governments mobilizing resources must be subject to a certain amount of skepticism. Also, what about private sector funding? Now, typically, private sector funding to developing countries involves high costs. So while commercial funding for projects in industrialized countries may involve interest payments of, say, perhaps 2% a year, when it comes to a middle-income country like India or Indonesia, the 2% becomes 8%. And then when it comes to a LDC, or when it comes to most countries in Africa, the interest rate exceeds 20%. And clearly such high costs of private sector funding are non-starters. So the global community has to find innovative financing sources or mechanisms to scale up financing to developing countries for climate change and biodiversity. Now, let me make some suggestions, and I'm certainly not the author of these suggestions. They have been widely discussed and to some extent are also under implementation, but I'm just listing them out. The first is a small levy of say 0.5 to 1% on international financial transactions. Originally, this was proposed by James Tobin, but not as a means of raising resources, but more as a way of stabilizing international financial markets. Now, what many scholars have estimated is that this mechanism may yield perhaps 500 to 1,000 billion a year USD, but certain assumptions are involved. And a number of issues with this mechanism have also been anticipated by scholars. And there was an earlier CUTS webinar in which this mechanism was widely discussed. However, more importantly, at the political level, this was formally presented to the UNFCCC some years ago, but to date, there has been no positive response from industrialized countries. A second is a carbon tax on international shipping and transport, payable by cargoes and passengers whose destinations are in industrialized countries. Of course, one can also think of collection from all cargoes and passengers, if that is politically feasible, which I suspect it isn't. But there are a number of institutional questions around which global agency. Can it be the Green Climate Fund? Will it be somebody else? Who will receive and administer the funds? And what is the schema of apportionment of these funds among developing countries? The third is abatement of exchange rate risk. Now, major part of the divergence in interest rates between developed and industrialized countries is due to perceptions of exchange rate risk. And once again, there have been proposals for setting up an international insurance mechanism to address exchange rate risk for developing countries. And this could be set up by an MFI like the World Bank. And the premium payments, which would be more in the nature of callable than upfront capital, could be made through the fisc from industrialized countries as part of their commitments under the climate change and biodiversity regimes. The idea has been under circulation for some time, but I cannot say that this has so far gained much traction. A fourth is a very interesting idea, which is termed the currency swap model, which has been test flown by the Asian Development Bank by way of a local currency loan in the Philippines. And briefly, what this involves is that supposing, say, India and Japan agree to set up a currency swap model among the two countries, then the Reserve Bank could lend some of its rupee holdings to the Bank of Japan. The Bank of Japan could lend the equivalent in terms of nominal exchange rates to the Reserve Bank. And with the rupee holdings that the Bank of Japan gains, it could make Indian currency loans to entities in India at the Reserve Bank lending rate, with a margin for an intermediary, for the due diligence of an intermediary, which would certainly be necessary. Now, this is a very interesting idea. And as I said, it has been test flown by the Asian Development Bank in Philippines. And the mechanism also addresses issues of tenure mismatch for long duration infrastructure projects. A fifth is the carbon market, several versions of which are well established. And there was a vigorous compliance market under the Kyoto Protocol for a number of years, until various political developments in the European Union essentially brought this experiment to a halt. But a new version is incorporated in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And it is expected that this carbon market will take off under the Paris Agreement. Of course, during the crediting period, the baseline of the host developing country will not shift. But at the end of the crediting period, the baseline would shift. The baseline would be set at the level of the technology which has been financed through the carbon market. A final suggestion or final enumeration from my side is conferment of intellectual property rights on genetic diversity and traditional knowledge on the use of biodiversity. This principle was accepted in the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing in 2010 under the Convention on Biodiversity. In principle, this will enable local communities to realize IPR's rents for access to the biodiversity and traditional knowledge on use of genetic resources. And part of the issue here is that not that many developing countries have actually set up traditional knowledge IPRs, domestic IPRs regimes. But this is work in progress, and this certainly holds some promise. Now, I can, in this brief intervention, I can do no more than give a listing of these mechanisms. And of course, the other panelists will also have their own suggestions. And perhaps we can discuss these various suggestions at greater length during the discussions. So let me now invite Otaviano Canuto. He is non-resident senior fellow, Brookings Institution, and advisory board member of CUTS WDC. So, Mr. Canuto, you have the floor.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. It's really a pleasure and honor to be here, and I appreciate the invitation. So let me try to be complimentary to what's Prodipto Ghosh opened very widely a good range of possible solutions to let's say to leverage the finance available for climate and biodiversity by addressing the question on the extent to which the global multilateral financial architecture is, let's say, able to respond to the inadequate availability of finance for climate and biodiversity, particularly after the globally disruptive events of the last few years, the perfect storm encompassing not only the pandemic but also the aftermath of the Russia-Ukraine war, the invasion of Ukraine, and the food and fuel crisis that follow up. In a nutshell, I would say that currently the global multilateral financial architecture is really very much constrained to be effective on the scale required for that response. And the scale of finance needs is gigantic, both on not only climate and biodiversity, but also keeping in sight that the other sustainable development goals have also not been met. And the scale is enormous, as Prodipto Ghosh aptly highlighted. So the globally disruptive events, they have provoked, they submitted, in fact, most of the developing world to economic shocks and the loss of fiscal buffers, increased indebtedness, and overall an erosion of credit worthiness. And not by chance, these shocks have led to a decline in growth prospects and left the most of the developing world exposed to further crisis. Fact is that progress on poverty reduction has been brought to halt, and most developing countries are off track on most of the sustainable development goals. I think it's important to highlight this because the targets and the support, the finance for climate and biodiversity cannot be in detriment to also the financial support that must be dedicated to the other sustainable development goals. So, but the fact is that while we still have this necessity on the other sustainable development goals, there is obviously the recognition of the need to respond to the pressing global challenge, climate, fragility, and future pandemics as well. So the developing countries will be the most adversely hit, and they have much more limited capacity to respond to the impacts of climate change. So the point is that development finance faces a double challenge. The institutional architecture at the global level is confronting a double pressure. One, supporting the unfinished development agenda. Two, taking on the responsibility of new global priorities. So mobilizing additional financing remains a considerable challenge for implementing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, while there is an immediacy to scale up investments in climate action and biodiversity finance. And in turn, it's important to highlight, the global multilateral financial architecture's response to crisis has been used to the limit. And this has shortened the global multilateral financial architecture's ability to do more. So that's why leveraging innovative finance for climate and biodiversity as we approach here today, should be treated as a way to amplify that response to the double challenge, right? And the figures are very high. I will not repeat what Dr. Prodipto has already said, but let me highlight that there is a growth story. There is an upside, which is the fact that a strong climate action can unlock a new growth story. Of course, because then developing countries could be poised to exploit those new opportunities, given that so much of their infrastructure has yet to be built. So what is now needed is a big and sustained investment push on sustainable development in developing countries, because that would drive a strong recovery for the present crisis, that would allow for restoring momentum to the SDGs, and to ensure that we can keep climate and nature goals within reach. But let me, okay, I will not go on estimates. Let me just give me the liberty to mention a recent work released in April by two of my colleagues at the Brookings, Kommukuri and Bhattacharya, where they estimate a need to investments that should rise to $5.9 trillion by 2030, compared to $2.4 trillion in 2019. And interestingly, about one half of the incremental investments would be needed for climate action, and the remainder for the rest of the SDGs. That, of course, most of the incremental finance will need to come from domestic sources, but they estimate that at least $1 trillion in annual incremental external financing will be needed. Now, let me use the World Bank Group, where I worked for many years. I was a vice president at the World Bank, and I was also a member of the board of executive directors twice. Let me use the World Bank Group as a major illustration of what I said about the little space that is there now for relying currently on the global multilateral financial architecture to ramp up such investments that I mentioned. So there is a pattern of the World Bank response to crisis. We can see that in the sharp counter-cyclical lending that took place in 2009, 2010, after the global financial crisis, and now again in 2020. The danger always is that the crisis response comes from drawing down crisis buffer funds and front-loading other resources. So the design of the World Bank, like in the other institutions that use similar mechanisms, it allows a temporary expansion of loans, but not a steady state expansion. And to the point that it is expected that IBRD and IDA disbursements, in the case of the World Bank, will fall after the ongoing surge is over, the surge that started in July 2023, unless action is taken. See, even after, let's say, considering the major upswing in crisis-related lending over the last 2 years, the ratio of gross disbursement to general government expenditures of client countries, excluding China, which must be treated as a case apart because of the size. So the ratio of gross disbursements by IDA and IBRD to general government expenditures of client countries, as I said, has fallen by about one-third. And this decline is not even distributed, of course. To some extent, the low-income countries are receiving amounts of grants and credits that are roughly the same as 2000, recovering from a dip through 2015, while the lower middle-income countries, where now India, for instance, is classified, saw the same dip followed by a partial recovery. In fact, in the case of government expenditures, IDA and IBRD combined they provide something about 1% of total government expenditures. So the decline has been dramatic, and at the moment in which we need the ramp up of those kinds of support. Now, in the case of the middle income countries, I participated as an executive director at the board of the World Bank in 2018 of the last capital increase, and the graduation discussion income came to the fore. The graduation discussion income corresponds to something currently close to $6,795. The discussion was that those countries, the countries above that, should be kept below 30% of the total IBRD exposure. And this acts as a limit on the degree to which IBRD can be an effective lender to those countries, especially the larger clients in this group. So what one may conclude is that there is an exhaustion of lending space. And so let me go to my second part of my talk. I'm referring to, let's say, some overriding questions that are coming to the fore in that regard. Besides, obviously, from everything that I said, the need to increase the funding capacity of the institution. First topic is the implication of the mission widening for development-related global public goods. I must tell you, one of my current occupations is also being a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, that is headquartered in Morocco. And the Policy Center for the New South has been doing a work together with the Center for Global Development on the relationship between international financial institutions in Africa. And there is a strong debate. We are preparing a note on this to feed. Policy Center, we're also preparing a note for the T20 led by India. There is an ongoing debate about extending the World Bank's mission to encompass global public goods. There is a fear that might be, let's say, a crowding out of available resource for purely development-related needs, and this is of course there is there are the development-related global public goods, particularly associated with climate change and biodiversity, agriculture, health, and infectious disease. But the point is that we need to have development of finance available for both sides of the equation, not only simply the climate-related agenda, which reinforced my point about the need to have really the complementarity between what we are discussing today and also other more traditional forms of finance. Now, let me highlight, since we're talking about innovation, an important point. It will not be possible to move things forward without the resolution of the current debt insolvency situations of many low-income countries and some middle-income countries. We should not lose sight of that. And the challenges are the complexity of the creditor structure that we have today. One must not abstract the increased relevance of China's finance. Not only China, but also we have other middle-income countries emerging as creditors. And so any attempt to pursue multilateral debt forgiveness, as the recent experience by the G20 showed quite clearly, has to have on board at the table all these new participants of the creditor structure. Look, just illustrating with the case of Africa. In 2020, debt service payments in more than 20 African countries represented over 14% of public revenues. And in the case of 5 of those countries, this ratio was higher than 30%. And Africa does if we want to look a little bit behind at the turn of the century, when I was arriving at the World Bank, most of Africa's public debt was owed to multilateral institutions and some bilateral creditors of the Paris Club. Well, since then, private investors seeking alternative low rates from developed countries were attracted by the yield prospects offered by African sovereign bonds. And this interest in commercial debt increased the share of private creditors from 20% in 2010 to more than 41.3% in 2020. Along with the increase in private creditors in Africa, the profile of bilateral creditors has also changed, as I referred to. The share of external debt held by bilateral lenders, mostly, let's say, the traditional Paris Club members, declined from 52% in 2000 to 10.3% between 2000 and 2020, whereas China has strengthened its position as the largest lender to Africa. In 2020, it was estimated that 17% of the total external debt of the sub-Saharan region was owed to China. The points that I'm making about Africa also applies to a large extent to other debtor countries in Asia. So this shift in the creditor landscape presents a challenge to negotiations of debt restructuring. We saw this within the common framework for debt treatment launched by the G20 in 2020. And new creditors from emerging markets such as China, India, Saudi Arabia, and others have not historically participated in those coordinated official creditor mechanisms. They often prefer bilateral discussions. And given the circumstance in terms of geopolitical divergence, this coordination has become even more challenged, right? Obviously, as well, the private creditors tend to be reluctant to offer debt reduction when they perceive that official creditors are slow to act. So the point is here, and we are preparing, for instance, a note to the T20 on a debt relief to climate initiative, which is an idea of integrating debt reduction with climate investments as an initiative to assist in bridging the financing gap for climate adaptation and mitigation in developing countries, specifically in Africa, in the case of our note, but that can be more made on a broader sense. We strongly believe that, and that's, there will have to be as well the inclusion of the debt of multilateral institutions in the debt relief, in the efforts to reduce the burden. That's the point that it's important to make, which would facilitate having on board the non-traditional bilateral creditors that I mentioned, okay? Second point, one needs to have less stringent risk management in the multilateral financial intermediation. I would see the G20 Capital Adequacy Framework report offered some recommendations with respect to stretching the use of existing financial capacity. By stretching, I refer here to lowering the leverage ratio and allowing the MDB's existing capital to support higher lending. Right now, for instance, the World Bank's 20 billion of paid-in capital plus the 30 billion reserve, which is part of its equity base, supports about $230 billion of lending, which is a leverage ratio just over 20%. The case of IDA, of course, the concessional arm, the whole funding is almost entirely equity funded. So $179 billion of borrowing support, $184 billion of lending. The point is that the bank needs to stretch its balance sheet, right? Well, but let's be realistic with respect to stretching and how limited it is. The a recent paper, which is an important paper, produced by the management of the bank and discussed by the board, which is the evolution roadmap, which will, let's say, frame the discussion to happen in the annual meeting in Marrakesh. I've made an estimate, and it says that reducing the capital to asset ratio of the World Bank, IBRD, from 20% to 19% would release $5 billion per year, almost nothing vis-a-vis what is needed. So paid-in capital has to be incremented, has to undergo new series of increase. That's the point. Now, still, another point of the new structure, pivoting from a country-only focus to regional approach, because this new enlarged mission for multilateral institutions, that is to say, the addition of the uplift in priority of global public goods, including climate change, will demand a very deep operational change in those institutions. And I can tell, I work there. It's not something easy to obtain. The multilateral development banks, they have operated on a model where the country governments are the clients. And the operations of the institutions are determined by the country's demand for financing expertise. So reorienting the strategic priorities to include development-related global public goods, right, will necessitate moving away from an exclusively country-focused operational model to one where regional importance becomes increasingly important from the perspective of project finance. Think of water and forests in our case here. It doesn't make sense to do it on a country-only base. It will have to reflect a more regional approach. Moving to the end, I still on the innovations. Let me make two final points. One, the obvious one, is the acknowledgement of the need to the extent of possible, crowd in private finance. This discussion has been on. Not that simple, but it is very much important. The global, multilateral, regional, and national financial institutions may play a leading role in working with the private sector and other stakeholders in constructing a new highway for private finance. This is much more than mobilization ratio. It will entail the co-creation of investment opportunities, tackling impediments in investment climate, development on investment pipelines, supporting local market development, effective risk mitigation instruments deployed at scale, and blended finance to reduce the cost of capital. Say, any one of us who has worked with, particularly in the case of green infrastructure projects, you have what? You have a matrix of risks that it is associated with any infrastructure projects value chain. Think in terms of value chain. And typically, when you look at those projects and ask why there is not higher participation of the private sector, and then one realize that some of the risks of that matrix are very hard to be dealt with by the private sector. So the point is that, multilateral institutions and national development banks could try to, instead of trying to finance the whole thing, they could offer coverage to those specific risks. And by doing that, they make possible the joining in, the crowding in of private finance for the whole thing. So this is something that should be explored increasingly. The institutions are moving that direction, but that may not be enough. And final point, since we're talking about today on innovative source, let me also mention something that has not been explored, but who knows, which is a proposal made by several ones. It comes to mind Ricardo Hausmann, but also particularly Brad Setzer and Stephen Paduano from the Council of Foreign Relations, which is the use of the SDRs of special drawing rights. See, one major challenge faced by the plea that I made about raising capital, paid-in capital for these institutions, let's face it, is the fiscal tightness in many, even donor countries. Things are not easy. We saw last week the approval of
yeah, Mr. Canuto, if I may, request you to wrap up.
Yes, this is the wrap up. This is the wrap up. If we look at the what happened last week in the US to approve the debt deal, the debt ceiling issue, it came with a fiscal tightening in the following years. So they will not be easy to obtain finance. So an obvious place where to find a way to boost the financing capacity by the institutions is by, why not, issuing bonds, having these institutional collateral banks, issuing bonds denominated in the IMF's reserve asset, the special drawing rights, settled in hard currency, right? But that would make a way to avoid the fiscal impact on developed countries of raising the paid-in capital of the institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Canuto, for your very wide-ranging presentation. And of course, it's not possible for me to try and summarize your key points, but I'm sure that your observations will prompt a lot of suggestions and questions and comments when we come to the discussion stage with the participants. So now I would like to invite Galit Palzur. She's a risk strategist, disasters, climate change, and extreme events at the GARP SCR. So Ms. Palzur, you have the floor, and kindly try and complete your presentation in 10 to 12 minutes.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank CUTS for inviting me here. I find the discussion very timely and necessary, and I'm happy to have a chance to present my views. And given the suggestion by Dr. Ghosh, I would like to address the need, specifically the need to use blended finance as there is no one solution for all. And basically, we all know that ODAs or public finance is not enough to cover the financing, and I'd like to focus on adaptation because mitigation is much easier to find, let's say, private sources. So let's go to the problematic issues of financing adaptation. And here I find, like everyone, that there's a drastic need to increase the resources from the private sector. So by using blended finance, one can leverage the public funds and allow risk sharing among the partners, and also reduce the cost of capital, as mentioned by Mr. Canuto earlier. Let's say the biggest problem with adaptation finance is that the big chunk of it has no direct revenue streams, which makes it extremely challenging to attract private investment. So blended finance, I would say, which include public allocations, would give the incentive to the private sector to enter. But still, of course, we all know that there is not enough public resources. And the question is how to generate the sources. This is the question we are asking today. We're looking for innovative solutions. So if I just take for a moment the issue of the universal FTT that we were talking about earlier, people must understand that such a proposition is disconnected from the incentives. What I mean is that let's say people consider me as an environmental economist. And when in environmental economics, the focus is on externalities, on the externality element of pollution and emissions. And in order for us to take these externalities into account, like with the use of a carbon tax, basically the governments internalize these externalities by creating a price on carbon. And raising prices to internalize these externalities creates the incentive on the emission-intensive activities to alter their behaviors. And once you charge an unrelated tax, which I don't oppose it, but I just want to stress that once you charge such an unrelated tax, it removes the incentive to change behavior. It's just another tax. So that's something you have to keep in mind. And what I find more interesting is the use of the carbon markets, to utilize the carbon markets for blended adaptation financing. And this is generally speaking, let's say adaptation projects usually face challenges in demonstrating what is called additionality, because they involve measures to address future climate risks or existing rather than reducing emissions. So that's their problem. That's why the current carbon markets are not built to finance adaptation measures. There are, I should mention that there are some initiatives like the climate finance labels, or the adaptation certificates, that these basically try to identify the co-benefits and positive climate impacts of adaptation measures. So if we put aside the issue of the carbon markets, that there are problems with greenwashing and the distrust and everything, I think it's crucial to develop the carbon markets for adaptation. Yes, carbon markets are in their infancy, but still they still retain the connection between the polluting or the emissions and the needed funding. And what I think these carbon markets can be used for adaptation measures where there are carbon credits created, and not all adaptation projects create these let's say carbon credits. So if we put aside that the carbon markets, if we put aside the generation of the part of the market that creates credits, like there are so many projects in adaptation that do not create credits. And this is where I like to focus the additional input I have. I'm talking about projects like seawalls or flood barriers that, or even like reducing heat in urban areas. That carbon markets cannot help there because there are no revenue streams. So I was thinking, and what I find useful is to raise private capital, not by like an FTT, but still something that is related to the real economy. And this concept is of twinning adaptation projects. The concept of twinning is not new. Today, it is mostly used for knowledge transfer, capacity building, and collaborations. And only a few examples I found of financing. So I would suggest taking money from developed countries and allocating these funds in adaptation projects that specifically have no revenue streams. Now the question is, how do you build the funds? Where do they come from? What are these twinning projects? So today, governments and local authorities around the world require in their tenders and other projects that bidders undertake development and improvements of public infrastructure surrounding the project site. And I believe that it is possible to do these, to require twinning with adaptation projects of certain sizes in vulnerable countries. And of course, there would be inventory or a catalog of ready to deploy pipeline projects that are in line with the priorities of developing countries. It's important that developing countries have the ability to say what are their priorities. That's one of the problems that they are addressing with MDBs today, and this kind of suggestion would be probably in line with the global stocktake that is currently being evolved. And we all talk about the problems with MDBs or the IGOs, the bureaucracy, the credibility, that the transparency issues. So this model will remove all these bureaucracies. It would allow some removal of political risks that are associated with channeling funds through many stations until it reaches the end user, even if the funds reach the right project in the end. So I believe, like, when you have a twinning projects from a developed country to a specific project, concessional, yes, no debts, because there is no streamline of revenues. Of course, my biggest issue with this model is that developed countries would oppose it at first, because it raises the cost of the initial projects that if they're commercial projects or residential projects or any other projects, then the consumer will pay for these because it will be included in the price of the bids. So, but I personally, as an economist, I don't think it's much different than imposing a tax that would then be collected for other countries. So you're still allowing the real economy to you're keeping the focus on emissions, and you're not disconnecting the relationship between the real economy and the financial sector and transactions. Even though I have thoughts about the FTT as well, but we don't have time currently. What else would I like to say? I think it's not a tool that fits everyone. Like there will probably be projects that will be better for I began with the carbon markets, so I believe the carbon markets might be better for twinning in several areas of focus. But for those areas of focus that you can't have anything else than grants or concessional public funds, that's where I would suggest the twinning to force the let's say the business sector, because in the end it's the business sector, even though it falls on the consumers in the end, but the business sector takes some sort of, let's say, active role in what is happening elsewhere because of what they're doing. I think I will stop here, and it would be wonderful to hear the rest of the panelists as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Palzur, for this very interesting presentation and your very insightful suggestions. And I'm sure that the participants will have some questions and suggestions to make to you when we come to the discussions. Let me invite Chaitanya Sravanthi Kommukuri. She is Senior Vice President at the Kotak Mahindra Bank to make her presentation. So Chaitanya, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ghosh. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to meet all of you. And thank you, CUTS International, for inviting me. very interesting insights and thoughts from the panelists so far. What I would like to talk about is, build on what we have heard so far and speak about what currently are financial institutions doing in terms of pushing private capital towards climate-related projects, and what modes and methods are being used at the moment, and how can more of the capital be infused through incentives that various players can bring in. I would like to simply start by saying we have in the spectrum of climate investments, there are technological developments happening. There are community-based interventions that are being undertaken, and there are infrastructure projects that are being put up. So for each of this different sort of activity, economic activity happening in the climate space, banks and financial institutions are responding in the fashion that they have been engaged with these transactions. So for, say, for example, when we are looking at, infrastructure projects, financial institutions have been, giving project-specific funds to this to the development of projects, and they have always taken into account the various environmental, social, and governance-related risks. They also are increasingly development financial institutions and multilateral development banks especially have been looking at what could be some of the climate related risks in these projects, and they are trying to either price in the way to mitigate that risk, or they are bringing innovative solutions to address that risk. And they're working with governments to ensure that systems are in place to mitigate that risk, etc. Now, the way to look at, even when we are looking at community-based interventions that are addressing climate needs, I think a couple of examples were spoken about where, solutions that involve community may be, watershed development. It may be something to do with afforestation, and reforestation, where credits are generated through planting trees, etc., and livelihoods are being built up. Financial institutions have been playing a role of more as providing grants, and as Ms. Palzur was saying, that there are no streamlined revenues coming out of such projects. So the intervention of private finance will be in different forms, depending on the kind of activities that they are funding, or rather channeling the money to. So given the scope and breadth of how interventions are activities are happening, and how financial companies are intervening, a few incentives were brought out by Mr. Canuto, where he mentioned that either we encourage financial institutions. He specifically spoke about multilateral institutions, where they can increase the leverage and essentially fund more with the same amount of reserves. Now, that's something that private institutions across the world can be open to, but again, those channels, the channeling of money will be dependent on the regulatory requirements in place. Say, for example, if the risk weights are adjusted for climate-related financing, then there would be more, the banks and other, NBFCs will be more inclined to increase their investments in these, for climate-related activities. That's one approach to look at it. The other way is to enable the private financial institutions which have a larger reach into the segments and markets which can which have the potential to develop such projects. To enable the reach of these institutions extensively, there can be credit enhancement support that can come from multilateral institutions. Risk sharing mechanisms have always been viewed in a favorable manner by financial institutions, because it shows that there is skin in the game for not just the entity that is interacting with the outcome provider, but also with the person who is sharing the risk. So this will effectively enable financial institutions such as banks to look at projects that they would otherwise consider extremely high risk, either because of longer tenor or either because of technologies not being fully established. While there will be some interventions happening, if the technology is really nascent, you usually have venture capitalists, we have incubation centers, accelerators getting into the space of developing those technologies into a commercial model where, say, traditional entities like banks can come and participate. But before something becomes a bankable model, I think interventions through companies setting up incubation centers and accelerators, this is also one way that private finance can be channeled through climate related solutions. I'm mostly speaking about mitigation, as you may have understood, because this is where structured financing modes have been enabled, and this is where established financial institutions can play a role. When it comes to, say, adaptation projects, I think bringing voluntary carbon credits into the mainstream carbon market will be something that will open doors, say, to both industrial players who would want to purchase these offsets, and also, say, financial institutions, to see how these credits can be used as a mechanism to engage with projects that generate these credits. But again, that is something that I think is in the pipeline for the Indian carbon market, at least, where they are saying that they will initially in phase 1 increase the demand for credits by letting buyers have access to the market, and in the second phase they will ask voluntary carbon credit suppliers, say through projects that reduce emissions by using more energy efficient cook stoves. There are some projects like this in India that are now becoming more acceptable and finding users. So what I'm essentially trying to say is, helping these carbon credits get into the market will also give one way for financial institutions to engage and push capital into climate aligned projects and technologies. While these are there would, well, I've mentioned a couple of them. The larger set of things that may need to be addressed is, having something akin to the, HSN codes that have enabled trade much more seamlessly, say, in the international market. Right, so something akin to HSN codes, if we can clearly identify which are those non-negotiable definitions of what's green, what's social, and what's sustainable, that will clearly help entities like private financial institutions which don't have the capability at the moment to understand where they should be focusing on. So some level of harmonization in terms of what's sustainable will make a lot of sense and make lives easy for private financiers. There's also direction from, say, carbon intensive sectors. If we can understand which way are these sectors moving? What are, say, for example, is there a particular pathway, particular sector will move over the next decade, over the next 2 decades, depending on how the country is looking at changing its policy. I think that's, while there are a lot of directional policies being given by the government in India, if there is, if there are thresholds indicated in terms of, say, currently we are producing steel, where the number of emissions we are generating per unit of steel is X, and we would like to be at Y by this year. If directions like that can be given, by entities giving one singular direction to a nation or to emerging nations, if those can be inferenced from the global agreements, or if think tanks like ours can work in developing these, that is where I think private financial institutions will find it easy to find where they can have solutions. Currently, they have been working with companies, mostly foreign banks have been working with companies to help them showcase better performance on their climate metrics. There have been a few transactions in India as well, where clients have committed to showcase progress on climate metrics over a period of time, which then will help them draw the loans at a lower rate because of showcasing this performance improvement. So structures like this are also one mechanism through which private financial institutions can engage with clients, can engage with even governments. If say governments themselves, there is one interesting transaction that I came across, which is like a debt for nature swap. I think Ecuador has written off, the lender has written off a part of the debt when Ecuador has agreed to route that money to conservation efforts. While these are very early instruments for private financial institutions to participate in a serious manner, but say the larger path showing organizations like MDBs and DFIs do open up these transactions for discussions at the moment, and then maybe at a later point even private financial institutions would find it feasible. So this is the kind of support that will help organizations like private banks, like asset management companies to look at climate related funding in a more enthused manner. And I think over the period of time we have seen these investments going up from the private side, and with carbon markets becoming more and more accepted, and companies are taking reaching their goals seriously, I think this will only become stronger. These are just a few points I have. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Kommukuri, for these very interesting suggestions about how to enhance private sector lending for climate change and biodiversity. And of course, I think once again, probably the other participants will have some questions and suggestions for you. Ms. Sulu, you have the floor.
Yeah, sure. Hi everyone.
Yeah.
You can hear me, right?
Yeah, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay. All right. I was given navigating political economy issues surrounding the reappropriation of funds from a universal financial transaction tax to support least developed countries, which, to put in a sense, it could be challenging, but here are some of the suggested ways which could help. There is need for international cooperation. This can be done by engaging diplomatic activities to encourage agreement among nations particularly the major economies, on the significance of aiding LDCs in addressing environmental issues, emphasizing the potential advantages of a more dependable and sustainable world economy for everyone. There is also need for transparency and accountability. Make sure that the FTT funds are collected and distributed in a transparent manner. Create systems to track how money is spent and show how it effectively supports environmental, finance, and sustainable development in LDCs. This may allay worries about improper spending or money management from those developed countries, because most developing countries are known to misuse funds or use funds meant for other activities by allocating them to other things, especially by our politicians. There's also need for a multilateral approach. This can be done by facilitating discussions and negotiations between nations by using existing international forums like the United Nations or the World Bank. This should work together with these organizations to create a framework that take into account the unique needs and priorities of LDCs in order to distribute funds in an equitable manner. There is also need for gradual implementation, which is you maybe try to use the phased approach of implementing the FTT. Begin with nations that are more likely to be supportive, because not all nations could be supportive to the ideas, but you can do this by starting with nations which are comfortable with supporting the projects initiated by the FFTTs. This can help generate support and show the tax benefits of the effects, making it simpler to win over more people in the long run. Regarding local tools for sustainable finance in Africa to reduce reliance on external funding support, here are some of the options. How Africa or developing countries can help themselves in dealing with the environmental issues. This can be by introducing maybe green bonds. Encourage African businesses and governments to issue green bonds, which can be specifically created to finance environmental friendly projects and draw investors with an interest in sustainable initiatives. There's also need for the introduction of climate funds. Create regional or national climate funds to pool resources and finance climate-related initiatives across Africa. These funds may come from national budgets, contributions, or from the private sector, or joint efforts on the part of different nations. For example, in Malawi, we have carbon tax, which is put on the fuel. Like when you're buying a liter of fuel, you contribute the 0.5% to carbon tax fund. However, the problem might be how this money is used, because as it is, as of now, it is not used for that issue. There's also need for impact investment. This can be done by fostering environment that encourage the private sectors to fund sustainable projects in Africa. You can promote impact by investing in such projects to draw ethical investors. This may entail offering incentives, legal protection, and technical support to investors which are implementing projects which are environmental friendly. There's also need for carbon pricing. To encourage companies to reduce their carbon footprints, consider implementing carbon pricing mechanisms such as carbon taxes or emissions trading systems. These mechanisms can generate income that can be invested in the environmentally friendly initiatives and projects. There's also need for public-private partnerships, which will encourage collaboration between the international organizations and private sector companies and the government at large. This will help to jointly finance and carry out sustainable development projects. PPs can advance sustainable finance in Africa by utilizing their resources and knowledge into the technology, which will help in the environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sulu, for your presentation, and I'm sure that this will also engender considerable discussion and comments from the other participants. And now let me finally invite Mr. Sanjay Vashishtha. He is CEO of First Green Consulting Private Limited. So, Mr. Vashishtha, you have the floor.
Thank you, Prodipto. I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Thank you. So I will just put my thought more towards the carbon market and how this carbon market behaves to attract carbon financing. I have been practicing this carbon credits, CDM, and many other international mechanisms. Of course, as you rightly said, that there are developed countries on one hand, and there are developing countries on other hand. While developed countries has pledged, $100 billion per year, and for funding the development projects in the developing countries, and they fail to their targets, as well as we developing countries also not reaching to their targets of whatever desired goals of the carbon reduction. Now coming to there are various issues which are to be addressed. Firstly, the carbon market is a very non-transparent type of market, wherein we do not know like what kind of pricing we are going to see in future, and if you don't have an accurate idea about the carbon financing or a project for which you will be surely receiving the funding or not, if that is lacking, then some of the projects which are to be implemented solely based on the carbon financing, they are not implemented, or partially we do not reach to our target. As far as India has initiated many programs, whether it is a larger capacity of renewable addition, the RPO targets, the PAT scheme, all of these activities are heavily dependent on the funding requirement from as a low-cost finance to implement the better technologies or clean technologies adoption in Indian context. Of course, we have been recipient of the international investment in clean energy technologies, but it is not to that tune at which it is expected. And most of these investments were in renewables, but what about the other projects we have in India, like Ganga cleaning? A drive is there. We are doing projects in Sundarbans for afforestation.
You are muted, Mr. Vashishtha.
I'm muted.
No, now it's okay.
Yeah, I could hear him.
Sorry. So as I was telling, the renewables are not the only initiatives which Indian government is doing. We are doing a lot of afforestation work. The program of cook stove is very much a predominant program in India. The program of Ganga cleaning drive. So a lot of activities, but the issue is that in many of these activities, we remain most of these projects are not able to attract the international financing. The reason is that the market is not very well defined, the data is not transparent, the market mechanisms are not aligned. For example, the carbon credit rates are varying from $1 to over $20. So that is the level of variation. If we want to have on one side, there is a Europeans, they are trading separately under EU ETS scheme. India is trying to develop its own market. But what we are trying is a global uniform platform, which is currently missing. And if those implications are sorted out, then certainly we can develop the projects not only within Indian context, but also beyond India. And the project development requires, a very clear targets and goals for, attracting the finance. So whether it is renewables or the other projects, which are, as I talked, that many projects of waste to energy, waste management itself are. So the CDM mechanism is over. Now we are trying the GCC mechanism. We are bringing the Indian mechanism. So as developers, they are little confused, and hardly we are able to tap not more than 20% of the projects which can attract carbon finance. So I will not take much of time, but it is the time when we need to attract the carbon financing, and India can, play a very well role in terms of, we are having the G20 presidency, bring all the countries on a common platform, and bring a platform which is credible mechanism, which is acceptable to all the countries, whether developed and developing countries, and there should be a common carbon pricing so that the project finance can attract more and more innovations as the project developers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vashishtha. And of course, the problems of the carbon market have emerged over many years. There are a number of issues, but at the same time, there's the promise of scale under Article 6, which would also give some of the uniformity that you are seeking in respect of the carbon market. Of course, that's the compliance market. There is and will always be in parallel a voluntary market, which will, operate on a somewhat different footing. So that completes the presentations from our panelists. And now I would like to throw the floor open to the other participants. So kindly raise your hand, and also direct your, if it's a comment, that's fine. If it's a question, then kindly identify the panelists whom you think would be most appropriate to answer your question. So the floor is open.
Well, if I may.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Jayesh.
So I'd like to begin by thanking each of the panelists for this wonderful discussion. And climate change and biodiversity loss are indeed one of the most grave threats which we as the human race collectively face. So it's been a very interesting discussion wherein the panelists touched upon different elements of the crisis and what needs to be done to address it. I have a very specific question, with regard to the pace of acceleration at which, many of these instruments, which were discussed, such as a carbon tax, an FTT, as one of the panelists put it. So what could be done to devise a framework to ensure accelerated implementation of some of these measures in those countries, which are likely to face this disproportionate impact of the vagaries of climate change? And could India's G20 presidency play a role in helping devise such a framework?
So would you like to indicate which of the panelists might answer your question?
If Mr. Canuto could offer a comment on this.
Okay, so Mr. Canuto, would you like to take this question?
I will give my take, and it's a very interesting and complex one, and but I'm pretty sure that my colleagues will also weigh in. The major difficulty, in my view, is on how to implement the global carbon tax or something minimally homogeneous across we are not living through good times for multilateral endeavors. That has to be acknowledged from the upset. And the temptation has been mostly for countries or regions individually to make their own movements. We saw this in the case of trade. Let's think of trade. The European Union that has come with this common border, border adjustment common tax, alleging that since they are taking the initiative and they are pricing carbon inside, so and the others, or most of the others outside, are not, so they're erecting those tariffs as a compensating manner not to create a bias against their own producers because they are paying the carbon tax and so on. Of course, in practice, this opens the gate for many subreptitious protectionist measures by European Union and so on. And I know we all are complaining how this has become a very gruesome topic in discussions on trade and so on. But truth must be acknowledged that if they impose carbon tax inside, they cannot, their companies or their production cannot pay a price if the other ones don't do it. Then we move the Atlantic, where I live in the US. See, the possibility of the US creating a carbon tax is very low. The resistance, the way by which the polarization is so embedded in views, it makes it really hard to imagine that the incumbent government might be able to push forward with some at the subnational level. There are some attempts, but overall in the US, and having at the table all the major powers agreeing to something in that regard, I must confess that I'm very much skeptical as of this moment. So we could pushing. It is so inspiring. All the arguments that Mr. Prodipto Ghosh made with respect to all the international transaction tax and so on, and we should think of this as, let's say, as a target, but the applicability in the short term is very, very much unlikely. And we are running against time. We are running against time in the sense that the pace of, if we look at the IPCC latest assessments, the climate change is moving faster than the experts expected some years ago. It comes to my mind how the frequency of droughts and heats, what happened in India's wheat plantation last year, the soil reaching 45 Celsius, something without a precedent. We have the immediacy of the need of doing something about climate change, and unfortunately, the texture and the geopolitical difficulties. Even the WTO is not working. So we should not rely on expecting detailed multilateral arrangements so as to provide us with the instruments that we need. That's the broad point that I would like to make.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Canuto. You're very realistic. You're very candid, but I hope that we are able to get over the difficulties. And of course, CBAM has introduced a major spoke in the wheel, and it has the potential of disrupting the global trading arrangements. So I'm afraid of that. Anyway, so thank you very much for your intervention. So would anyone else like to come in? No questions?
Galit is raising her hand.
Yeah, if I would just like to echo what Mr. Canuto said regarding the situation in the US. This is exactly why my suggestion, and I was thinking about the ability of different states and different actors on different levels of administration to, if it's not like, let's start that. I do a lot of game theory let's say, rhetorics regarding climate change. And here, regarding the negotiations, it's quite obvious that reaching an agreement of that magnitude that will be actually done in practice is not high regarding the North and South, or developing or developed world. So if we find solutions that can help those specific players in the developed country that are willing and want to help give out concessional grants. I'm not talking about loans. So that would be something you have to think about regarding any suggestion that is on the table. That there will obviously be countries that are opposing it. And if we return to the question that Jaish asked, then it will take a long time to reach something that is acceptable for everyone. So we need to start with things with those that are willing. And I totally agree with Mr. Canuto on that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Ms. Palzur. Would anyone else like to come in? Any of the participants, or any of the panelists? So I see no hands.
Yeah.
So, well, maybe at this stage, let me invite the panelists if they would like to make any final comments or observations. So whoever would like to come in.
Let me, if I may.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I like it very much, the presentation, not only your initial overall introduction, setting out an important agenda, and very much enticing, and even if of difficult applicability, but also enjoyed very much all the points made by Galit, by Chaitanya, by Nyanyiwe and Mr. Sanjay, and just to put the emphasis on something. When we talk about complementarity between private finance and public finance and multilateral finance, we should keep in mind that it's not simply lumping sum the money from those sources into common funds. We have to go beyond that. What I want to highlight is the relevance of having the more public sector side of it, that is to say, public development banks, national development banks, multilateral institutions, offering coverage to specific risks that the management of which the private sector doesn't really feel comfortable. We could give here many examples. I think in all infrastructure projects I have ever worked with, one of the major risks and one of the source of concern by private investors was the risk of any halt in the initial credit creation during the project preparation process or the implementation. So if the World Bank, and it has done things like those, provides the insurance against a halt in private banking finance at the preparation process of a project, then it becomes easier for banks, private banks, financing the whole period of preparation of projects, including the implementation, the construction, until the project is fully operating. And that has made a difference in several water-related projects, for instance. But the point is that, and that makes all sense, because instead of, since the resource from financial institutions public financial institutions and multilateral is scarce. If you, instead of trying to, in the old fashion, to finance the whole thing, the whole water project, if you focus on specific segments of the value chain that are very much uncomfortable for the private sector, then private banks and private investors or bondholders are more willing to jump in. And then you have a result that is the fusion of private and public finance of infrastructure projects. This has to come to the mind. Galit spoke about bureaucracy, and it is true. I worked for many years in institutions. I also was a VP at the IDB, International Development Bank, and it is true that the internal processes and so on. But on the other hand, those processes are the counterpart of confidence that these institutions are really putting the money and ramping up the whole effort in true connection with the aims that are pursued. So there is a quid pro quo. I wouldn't call it entirely bureaucracy. It's a guarantee of confidence on the sustainability of what institutions do. It may look like bureaucratic and it can be sped up, it's true, but it's not simply a burden. It is part of the overall guarantee that the game of sustainability is really pursued. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Canuto. Any of the other panelists or any of the other participants?
I would like to add, Dr. Ghosh, excellent inputs, Mr. Canuto. Thank you so much. Just building on what you are saying, right? The support in terms of risk sharing from the public institutions and also, being a cornerstone investors in bond transactions. These are, some of the areas which can address private financial flows, like you suggested, essentially sharing the risk for us and also taking that lead investor position when, the institutions are not comfortable being the lead investor in very new and emerging spaces and sectors. So yeah, that's just two actionables that I thought I will just highlight and draw attention to. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Kommukuri. Anyone else? So if not, let me, make a few observations. So I think Mr. Canuto's, very clear suggestion that instead of trying to provide the entirety of funding for infrastructure projects, the MFIs, since they are very constrained in their lending, that they may identify the specific risks faced by the private sector and finance precisely those risks. And this would enable private financing to scale up. I think this is certainly a very useful suggestion. And I think, that for example, the proposal that has been put before the G20 about an insurance mechanism for forex risk is a step in this direction. But of course, there are other risks, that the private sector faces, and I think this is very important. I think Mr. Vashishtha mentioned about government giving a signal on an emissions trajectory, and I think some other panelists also mentioned that. Well, speaking as somebody who's been in government, there are issues that the governments face. For example, the first is that the tenure of a particular government is 5 years. And any commitment that they make or any signal that they make for a period beyond that may not have that much credibility. Second of all, that if you look at the developing countries, commitments before the Paris Agreement, that they are almost always premised on the provision of new and additional funding from developed countries or through the MFIs. Now, in the absence of some certainty about such funding being forthcoming, it is a little difficult for developing countries to give these long-term signals. And the third issue is that when it comes to the carbon market, giving a signal of a trajectory may be understood by the regulator of the kind of carbon markets as a pre-existing policy commitment, and therefore this pre-existing policy commitment becomes the baseline. So then that alone will eliminate the carbon credits that can be generated. So there are some issues about governments giving these long-term signals. Then another question of bureaucracy. Now, I have been, in a sense, fortunate having worked in two distinctly different bureaucracies, the Government of India and the Asian Development Bank. And it certainly seems to me that while the MFIs and the ADB follows pretty much the same due diligence requirements as the World Bank, that they indeed are rigorous and extensive so as to give comfort to the member governments that the lending is indeed sound, and that the projects will realize its objectives. But the fact is that the project cycle in MFIs is much longer than in national governments. And I do not really see that in respect of infrastructure projects, there is a great deal of difference in the actual performance, financial or economic, between infrastructure projects financed by the government, financed by the private sector, and financed by MFIs. Now, the new president of the World Bank, Mr. Banga, on his first day, he made a statement, I think, that the project cycle of the MFI system needs to be drastically reduced. And I think this would be a challenge because on the one hand, there is the need of accountability, that the governments would require assurance that the projects being financed are sound. But a lot of creative thinking will have to be done in the MFIs to shorten the project cycle. And also the costs of due diligence. The costs of due diligence in the MFIs are several times that in the private sector or in the government. So, we still have 10 minutes in case anybody would like to come in. So if not, let me thank all the participants and the panelists, for their very cogent, informative, and insightful presentations, and also to the participants for having given them a patient hearing, and finally to Cuts International for organizing this very important webinar on this 50th anniversary of the World Environment Day. So thank you very much indeed, all of you. And
Thank you.
I suppose I can wish all of you a happy Environment Day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me also join Prodipto in thanking all on behalf of Cuts, and we hope to continue this conversation with all of you as we develop a campaign out of this particular issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And have a good day.